Hey everyone, I'm here with Andrew Root. Andrew is professor of youth and family ministry at Luther Seminary and also the author of Evangelism in an Age of Despair. Hi Andrew, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great, and I'm really glad that we get to have this conversation together. Andrew, tell us briefly what you do.
Yeah. Well, I laugh because I'm in the middle of the chaos of the end of a semester. So
Uh,
mainly teach seminary students, but yeah, right on the practice of ministry, and think of myself as a practical theologian, and
mhm.
um, yeah, walk my dog a lot, and
Nice.
you know, and I'm a suffering Minnesota sports fan. That's pretty much. You can
Awesome.
see where the despair comes in the
There you
title.
go. There you go. And you write a lot of books. I don't know if you remember. You've been on this podcast once
Yeah, sure.
before. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
remember. Yeah.
Yeah. And that one. And I'll just tell folks. I don't remember what episode number it is. I'll put it in the intro or the outro. But it was on your book. That is it. The Church After Innovation. Is that what it was called?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, really great conversation there as well. Um, well, okay. So I'm excited to talk about your book, Evangelism in an Age of Despair. Really interesting title, kind of, whoa, what is this? Is it a how to? Sort of, but not really. So here's my first question. When you talk about the age of despair, what do you mean by that? And whose despair are you talking about? And when I say that, is it the world's despair? Is it the church's despair? Whose
Yeah.
despair? And what does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will say that I didn't come up with a title. So
Hmm.
if you hate the title, people can send their hate emails to Baker.
Okay.
And no, I like the title. I do like the title, but it is a bit of a clickbait title, I think.
Hmm.
And just, but you're really right. Like despair is a quite. It could go in multiple dimensions as we think
Mm-hmm.
about this. I had a book a long time ago. The title of it was "The Promise of Despair," and it was very
Okay.
much a book kind of looking at Luther's theology of the cross and Kierkegaard, and in those traditions, despair actually has a productive good to it. It's like, when we come under despair of sin, then
Hmm.
this God of mercy and grace meets us, and for Kierkegaard, we learn something in our despair. But here, I think in this title, and again, I didn't title it, but accepted the title, despair, it means something more cultural, I think,
Hmm.
than kind of existential. And the despair I'm getting at, really, I think another way we could phrase it is just an overall malaise of unhappiness.
Hmm.
And that I think these first 3 decades of the 21st century have been quite sad,
Hmm.
sad decades. I think
Yeah.
like we know statistically, like deaths of despair are way up, like suicide, drug overdose in the last, 3 decades. And that really comes out of the 90s. And I try to write this up in the book that the 90s were incredibly positive.
Hmm.
Like the
Hmm.
Cold War was over. It seemed like economic growth was everywhere. And it seemed broadly within society that we were at a good place. And
Yeah.
yet I think really since probably the late aughts, it's felt like a really tough time.
Yeah.
And despair has been everywhere. So really here,
Hmm.
despair, I don't mean it philosophically, I mean it as a kind of malaise, a sadness that it
Hmm.
has come over us, that often finds its manifestation in rage. Like you find a lot
Hmm.
of kind of
Yeah.
cultural rage out there.
Yeah.
And that people are just depressed, anxious, angry, and I think ultimately really quite lonely, that people are
Yeah.
really quite alone.
Yeah. Is there despair in the church at all, would you say?
Yeah, well, I think that despair comes in probably two different veins. One, as
Hmm.
people in every church are part of larger cultural realities. So
Yeah.
the despair that's in our and the sadness that's in our larger cultural reality. And I should add to that, one of the reasons I think we're so sad is circumstantial, but it's more than circumstantial. It's that we're so kind of hell bent culturally, and I think this finds its way into the church, on being happy. Like the pursuit is to be happy. And I think the more, in this odd way, that you make everything about being happy, the more you are susceptible to being quite depressed and sad. So I think that
Hmm.
filters into the church. But the other level, I think, of despair that finds itself in the church is just this foreboding that if we screw this up,
Hmm.
if our leaders screw this up, if our lay people aren't committed enough, this could all go away, or our denomination could go away, this congregation could go away. So there is a kind of despair around decline, I think, that exists as well, which in this kind of odd way has made evangelism, at least within the communities I'm in and the traditions I'm in, become something to talk about again. Or, like some of these kind of very mainline progressive denominations and congregations are even saying things to me like, well, I don't know if we're supposed to say this, but maybe we need to do evangelism again. And, they're saying that because they're ultimately afraid that they don't have enough people, that they don't have enough resources. So maybe even though they might feel a little uncomfortable with what evangelism actually means, they wonder if they might need to do it. So you can see the kind of despair at the level of decline that exists there as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what it does is it turns evangelism into something utilitarian, so to speak. Like it's Absolutely. Just a tool to achieve to get more people there on Sundays, and so that we don't go extinct. And that is a legitimate fear. The question is, well, I guess there's a question about motivation, and that's something for us to wrestle with, but also, what exactly is evangelism? What do we mean when we say evangelism? I grew up in Campus Crusade when I was in college, and I got really good at sharing the 4 spiritual laws. And it kind of worked, People prayed the prayer with me. I don't know how they're doing now, but some of them probably are there, I wouldn't use it now. Here's a little side story about evangelism. I went to Fuller. I was the video guy at Fuller for almost my entire time that I was there. And so I got to join Sherwood Lingenfelter, who was the dean of School of Missions, or maybe the provost at the time, and Dr. Bradley, I think, a church historian. And anyway, they were going to interview in Santa Barbara at a retirement center, like a renowned old theologian, maybe F.F. Bruce. I can't remember who it was exactly, but something like that. And I got to go with them because I was setting up the camera and getting it on video. Anyway, so I was sitting in the back seat while we're driving, and they're having a great conversation and also kindly doing their best to keep me in the conversation as well. And so they were talking about evangelism, and they got to talking about the 4 spiritual laws, in Campus Crusade. And so I said, do you think the 4 spiritual laws is an effective tool for evangelism? And Sherwood Lingenfelter said, thoughtfully, he said, the 4 spiritual laws is a great contextualization of the gospel for UCLA students in the 1950s. I was like, oh, wow, what a great way to think about that. But what it did was it said, okay, there are different ways to share the gospel at different times and in different places. It's contextual. And it's more than what we think it is. We're not limited to one little way of talking about Jesus. So anyway, I'm thinking just all of each church and each person maybe is called to find their way of bringing good news into a world of despair. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think first of all, that's a great story, and it's a beautiful way to critique something by affirming it.
Right.
I mean, in many ways, the book for really is putting central evangelism. But I think the constructive edges, and there is a little bit of a misnomer because obviously evangelism is in the title, but I think the work that's really done in the book is potentially the theology of consolation that comes out of it. So what I'm really interested in is thinking about what it means to console our neighbor, what it means to be with them in moments of brokenness and loss, and how that dynamic of actually sharing in the life of our neighbor, that there is a claim put on their life, but even on reality itself and the way that it's constituted. And there's a certain way of an invitation at its core. I think what evangelism is, I think it's very contextual. I think it's one of the other reasons it stays quite a relevant topic for us, even though when people have all sorts of stories about evangelism, you could do a whole reality show on evangelism gone bad. You know what I mean? But what it keeps, I think, well, it stays in our lexicon because it is really contextual. Like there's something about how it names what's happening in our contextual moment that's very important. And so I want to continue to really affirm evangelism as being an essential piece, but at its core, what evangelism is the response to the call of Jesus to come and follow. And so the big question, I think, for the pastor and the minister and the leader is like, well, what is that? And obviously it's contextual, but how in this contextual moment do we help people be confronted? And that sounds a bit too much like a negative word, but like have an encounter that they hear the call of Jesus to come and to follow. And that in some ways is to be evangelized. It's to receive the good news that's happening here. And inside these moments of despair that we're in and these sad times that we're living through, I think that there's something about hearing this call to follow being bore by people who will walk with you and console you. I guess that's one of the main contextual elements I'm trying to get at here is that we're living in very sad times because we're living in very lonely ones. And people have deep forms of grief and yet find no one to hold those experiences of grief. Like we have all sorts of opportunities for wellness exercises, and we have all sorts of ways to kind of develop ourself and become better at our vocations or our workout plans or whatever. But when we lose someone in our life or we find ourselves in some kind of deep moment of grief, there's very little in our cultural context that will walk with you in that. I mean, particularly like social media is awful at that, so you might write, just lost my dad, and you will get a lot of responses. You will get a lot of people who will do the sad face, the tear coming out of the eye. I'm so sorry. You'll get maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of responses. But then do that again the next day and see what happens. And then the next day, like that all is really that is not consolation. I mean, it's not an inhuman act to say, I'm sorry that you've lost someone. It's communicative, it is compassionate, but there's really no other, or the structure itself doesn't give you people who will walk with you in the midst of that. I read that on Facebook, I lost my dad, terrible car accident, lost my cousin or something. And I'm moved. I'm really sad about that. I say, I'm really sorry. I'm praying for you. And then I go onto my feed, and next thing I know, I'm watching 8 dog videos. And I've forgotten this has happened at all. I mean, there isn't the sense of that we've had in these religious traditions, particularly Christianity and Judaism, with just what it means to sit with people, what it means to console them in the midst of their grief. And I think one of the reasons people are so deeply unhappy right now is because they're really quite lonely. So the ground I'm trying to break is to kind of think about a theology of consolation that has a long tail in the tradition of what it means to console. I mean, it goes all the way back to the patristic fathers, and even thinking like, can you grieve someone who's dead? If you're a Christian, you believe in the resurrection. Is it appropriate to grieve at the graveside of someone who has died? Because there's been this long tradition of writing this, and these really great theologians have thought that a real big piece of the Christian life, a way that we hear the good news of the gospel and are called into a deep transformation that makes us Christ's disciples, is to find this Jesus in the moments of sorrow and suffering, and what it means to console one another and receive consolation takes us into a kind of mystical sacramental place where we're changed. And so that's where I'm kind of trying to go with thinking about evangelism. So even more than a book about evangelism, it's really a book about consolation that can become events of evangelizing.
One of the things I love about the book is this story that you sort of weave through, which is a fictional story, but it's realistic, and it's a way to make all of this sort of applicable to see, oh, this is what you mean by this in a real life context. And and so part of the story involves, I think, one of the characters losing a child, and was that right? And then another woman finding out she has stage 4 cancer a little bit later, and just sort of the ministry of consolation that they experience, and how those become moments of evangelism, not in the way that we tend to think about evangelism as you're a sinner and going to hell and you need to be saved. And guess what? Good news. Jesus died for you,
Yeah.
But how would you describe the good news, maybe in contrast or even comparison to the typical way we think about the gospel? How would you talk about consolation in comparison and contrast to that typical? What's the good news there?
Yeah, and then this fictional story that I write, which is, we were talking about this before recording, that it's a little self-indulgent to write this story, but I mean, what I'm trying to get at is a deep reality, and I think I have to show you it more than tell you. You know what I mean? So I hope it works, but I'm trying to kind of show you what this might look like in a congregation. So we meet these lay people who are part of a church, and not all the people we meet are part of a church, but these lay people are out in the world, and they have a kind of watchword that they've learned at their church, that, I mean, this is a huge element of leadership that they've taken as a way of being in the world, which is this sense that we follow Jesus into sorrow. And that Jesus is found in sorrow. And so when they're at work or they're having these experiences of people being in sorrow, instead of patting people on the head and saying, "I hope you're doing better," or whatever, they walk into that, and they're with these people in the midst of these experiences of sorrow. So the kind of evangelism, I guess, is very different here than the four spiritual laws. Like, again, let's not throw shade on the four spiritual laws. Maybe it was perfect in the 1950s in UCLA. But I think in this particular moment, which I do a lot of work to try to share how I think we're at this particular cultural moment, what we really need, what people yearn for, is someone who will journey with them into their sorrow and to proclaim and witness to a Jesus Christ who is present in sorrow. That Jesus Christ, as the traditions often said, the man of sorrows, meets us in the midst of sorrow. And so if evangelism is ultimately helping people meet Jesus Christ and the good news of what that meeting can mean for their lives and mean for their being, I think that there is this moment, this particular cultural moment, where people are just yearning for a friend who will co-suffer with them, and to give them a story that this suffering has significance and meaning, that it at the very least it matters deeply to God, and that God becomes near in these experiences, and that's ultimately kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I as you're sharing, I was thinking about sort of it's this silly example, but I go to funerals sometimes, and it's a funeral where the pastor is convinced he has to share the gospel in order to, right? Or he's not doing his job or her job. But it would be ridiculous to sit with someone who just lost a loved one and say to them, "Did you know that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and that sinners are separated from God, and human beings are sinful and separated from God?" Because that's not good news in that moment. It just sounds trite, and it sounds religious. You know what I mean? In the worst of ways. Yeah. So, so this is the challenge. One of the challenges for the church. We live as I like that you're talking about this as an age of despair, and because we talk about here at Church Leadership Institute just sort of being in a time of disruption, and despair is certainly an aspect of that disruption that we're experiencing today. Churches are declining, and churches are in despair. I'm a pastor, and the cynical part of me thinks, well, we're never going to grow again, slow decline. But I don't want to be cynical, because okay. So here's the question. Okay, let's say the church does decline. What does that say about the church? Or what, in the midst of that, what hope does the church have?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question. I guess I would say it this way. I don't think we should ever look at growth as a problem. You know what I mean? Like if the Spirit blesses the church with a lot of people coming, I don't think we should be like out of hand skeptical of that. But I also do think that it cannot be a primary sign of the Spirit working and moving that there is just growth.
Right.
And I think we can dangerously think only good things grow. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that's true. Like,
Mm.
the most obvious example of that is like
Mm.
cancer is a form of growth and it
Yeah.
kills, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think growth, I don't think we should ever turn this into a kind of firm kind of law that says things that are big suck and they are the devil. Only the devil grows things big. That would be a kind of
Yeah.
fundamentalism on the opposite side that would not be very helpful. But I do think as a kind of as a moral code, it's not very helpful, and is in some ways oppositional to Jesus' parables to assume that growth is the measure of faithfulness, so we get these
Mm-hmm.
very odd parables from Jesus, like that the one is greater than the 99, and you
Yeah.
think like,
Right.
well, that's really bad economics. You got 99 sheep and you're willing to risk those 99 sheep for the one.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, Jesus is making a larger assertion here that kind of connects to this thesis a bit of, really what matters is what it means to attend to the lost, what it
Yeah.
means to attend to the one who is carrying a
Mm.
heavy burden. There's
Mm.
something that's really essential in that piece.
Yeah.
And so I do think there's a word here for pastors in the sense that I think in this moment, where if we interpret despair as loss of market share,
Mm.
then people in the midst of suffering or sorrow, um, well, that just becomes a distraction to you. And I think one of the things I'm trying to push here is that may not be a distraction. That may be the very place where the Spirit is moving,
Yeah.
and where God is renewing the
Yeah.
church, and bringing the good news. And at the core of what evangelism is and what the church is called to witness to is the very good news that Jesus enters our sorrow, turns what is
Yeah.
dead into life,
Yeah.
and renews us in that way.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I love that language of Jesus entering our sorrow. Um, Having been through my own times of sorrow, it was like in those times that I, in a way, felt most united with Jesus. Right, the whole idea of I've been crucified with Christ became real to me in those times of sorrow in ways that it doesn't when things are going great.
Right.
Um, and there is, right, a rich, profound hope in that I'm not alone in this. Now, the challenges you've been saying is that churches aren't very good at entering people's sorrow. One of the words you used just now was the word attend, right? Attend to the lost. Usually we think of evangelism in terms of we need to convince persuade or compel
Right.
the lost, right?
Right.
Say just a little bit more about attending. And I think just as you
Yeah.
think about this answer, that's part of maybe the adaptive shift in a lot of churches anyway, right? Thinking about not trying to convince or persuade or compel the lost to
Yeah.
believe certain right doctrines in order for them to, go to heaven when they die, or just to believe certain things so that they'll start coming to church every Sunday because that's what we need. But what does it look like to then attend to the
Yeah.
lost?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will say that this book is I think of it a bit as my French book. Not that it's written in French, but there's a lot of kind of like French
Right.
stickers
Yeah.
in it, and really why I do that is I'm trying to tell a story on why happiness becomes
Mm-hmm.
such a central thing to us. And
Yeah.
America is the land of where the pursuit of happiness is
Yeah.
written right into our founding documents. That
Yeah.
this is supposed to be a land where you can pursue your happiness. And so
Yeah.
we think of it as an American phenomenon, but it really comes from France. That
Yeah.
the founders were reading this guy named Michel de Montaigne, and
Mm-hmm.
Montaigne really saw that the point of human life was to return to your chateau and to live a happy life. And a great reader of
Mm-hmm.
Montaigne was Thomas Jefferson. And
Mm.
Jefferson's picture of what America was
Yeah.
a land for people like Montaigne, where you could
Yeah.
seek happiness and just sleep when you
Yeah.
sleep and pet your cat when you pet your cat. There's a kind of contentedness that we think about this. And
Yeah.
I think this is one of the interesting moments of despair right now is people want so badly to be contently happy and can't find it. And
Mm-hmm.
so they turn and they blame this politician or this family member or whatever for
Yeah.
their sense of not feeling contented. And so I try to tell that French story about the person I get to that I think gets directly to your question is Blaise Pascal, who writing about 300 years after Montaigne, and people maybe know the name Blaise Pascal because he's the inventor of the calculator and probability theory that makes Las Vegas and insurance possible. Like they're still using Pascal's theorems to do probability theory stuff. So he's like one of the great polymaths of European history. But Pascal was living in a kind of time of a renaissance of Montaigne, and everyone was trying to be Montaigne, and everyone was trying to be happy. And ultimately, what Pascal came to the conclusion of is that it is impossible. That to try to be happy is actually an impossible thing. That you really can't be contently happy. You can't be content in your happiness. It just will not work. And he said the reason he knew that is because he was a gambler. And before he had his own conversion experience, he liked to gamble at the salons in Paris. And he realized that you would say...
Is that why he came up with probability theory?
That's exactly why he came up with probability. It's exactly why. He would start to do probability theory to see if he could help his friends win more money gambling. So
crazy.
But he realized that as a gambler, like you say, okay, if I win this big hand, I'll be happy. Like that'll be it. That'll be it. I'll be contented. I'll be fine. And then you win it. And he says you walk away from the table, and it doesn't take but an hour where you steal, or all of a sudden the discontent comes over you again, and you end up back there. You can never find this contentedness that you seek for. So Pascal came up with his wager, which is kind of what everyone thinks about and about Pascal. And we even think about this as maybe a paradigm for evangelism, but we misunderstand it, because Pascal's wager is often framed as you have an either or here. There either is a God or there isn't a God. And we're back to gambling again. So if you bet that there isn't a God and then you die and find out there is a God, well, you're screwed. Right. You know, you're in big trouble. But if you bet there is a God and then you die and find out there isn't a God, well, not a bad bet. I mean, you don't really lose anything. That's how we tend to interpret Pascal's wager. But then you think this can't be one of the smartest men in European history, because it only takes a 13-year-old to break that logic down.
Right.
It actually does cost me a lot. Like all the fun I could have had, all the things I could have gone to Vegas and had a lot of fun if I didn't take this side of the bet.
Right.
This is actually not Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is exactly to your point here, and your question is, his wager is that if you will admit that you cannot be contented, that you cannot solidify and lock down your happiness, that happiness is but a fleeting feeling that comes and it goes. When it's here, great, celebrate it, but it cannot last forever. If you will realize that, and you will turn into that, and you will actually allow yourself to tumble into your sorrow. What his great wager is that if you will admit that and tumble into your sorrow, that you will find a great presence there, that you will find Jesus Christ who meets you in that. So your either or is, you can either keep running after contented happiness and never stop and burn yourself out looking for it, or you can admit that there is something outside of you that you need to meet you to save you. And and if you can admit that and make that confession of sorrow, he thinks you'll find a great presence there. So I think what the church actually says to the world is, this is what it means to be human, is that we can never really be contented. But what we believe is that there's great hope and good news in that, is that while we can never be contented in our happiness, we can, in the midst of claiming our brokenness or sliding into it or following into it, walking into it, we really do believe you'll find a great presence there. Now, the one thing that Pascal didn't say that I think the church today has to say is you can't do that alone. You can't do that by yourself. So you need a community of people who will walk into that sorrow with you, because you can fall if you do it by yourself, it's too risky. You could fall into a deep despair. But with a community who will walk with you, we think you'll find a great presence in the midst of your sorrow. And to me, that's the call of evangelism, is not, we know something other people don't. We have information that if you accept it can make your life perfect. It's that there is something there is a person in Jesus Christ who meets us in this sorrow and transforms us in the midst of it. And this is a community of people who can't fix you, who can't make you happy, but
Yeah.
who can walk with you in the deepest forms of grief and the deepest human longings, and encourage you in the midst of that sorrow, that you'll
Yeah.
find a great presence there.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And I hope that, I hope that the church leans into that and discovers that that is a big part of our calling. I have one more question related to all of this, but one of the things that you said that kind of jumped out at me, partly because I did the Camino de Santiago a few years ago. You said evangelism is pilgrimage. And, I paused and I thought about that. I'm like, yeah, because anyway, I want you to unpack that. But my thought was like, we tend to think of evangelism as an event. Oh, I just evangelized that person, right? But you say, no, it's a pilgrimage. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it's a pilgrimage in the exact way that it says, come and walk this. Come and walk this with us. Well, the only way you'll know if it's true is if you start walking it. And you maybe watch our lives for a bit as we walk this, but eventually you have to walk this. And so one of the elements I get at is that, particularly a medieval pilgrimage, that it always, well, first of all, the pilgrim assumed that they didn't know if they would ever return. So when you did a pilgrimage, you did it ad diem, to God. You would always do it to God. So a pilgrimage is different than a workout, or even running a marathon. You don't do that to God necessarily. It's a pilgrimage when it's aimed to God. But the other really fascinating thing is, in the 14th century, a idiom for goodbye was ad diem. So like when we end this podcast, I would say ad diem, to God, goodbye. And so there's a correlation there with the pilgrim, that the pilgrim is always saying goodbye. And you say goodbye to your life when you walk it. And particularly for a medieval pilgrim, you didn't know if you'd ever make it home. You're going to go walk 60 miles or 100 miles or something, and you didn't know what you're going to meet on the trail. You didn't know if you were going to survive that. Some people did it barefoot. You had no idea. So a lot of pilgrims would write their will and testament before they would go on pilgrimage, because it was a walk into their death in some ways. It was aimed towards God, but it was a great goodbye. And I think what we say what I mean when I say that evangelism is pilgrimage is it's an invitation for people to walk, and to have others accompany them as they'll say goodbye. And there is no human life that gets to be lived without having to say goodbye. We are always, as human beings, saying goodbye, saying goodbye to one phase of our lives, saying goodbye to our children when they were young, and now they're, young adults. All marriages and love affairs come to an end. I mean, someone dies before someone else. There's a moment of, you have to say goodbye, and to be a human being is to have to be ad diem, and say goodbye. And yet, I think to be evangelized, if we want to use that term, is to do that toward God, to God. And so I do think in this moment of sadness, it is not necessarily a moment of apologetic that evangelism happens, but an invitation to walk a path, of life, not alone, and into your great goodbyes, and to find those directed towards God, and find God's presence there.
Just reflecting on what you were saying, it's like we're called to become the kind of people who walk alongside, right? Rather than target people with ideas or programs, or even target people with consolation. It's not about targeting people; it's about walking with people. And I love that. Andrew, thank you for this book. Thank you for a great conversation. And let me just ask you, if anybody wanted to find out more about you and the work that you're doing, where could they go?
Yeah, probably the easiest place is I just have a website, which is andrewroot.org, and you can find any information you need there. Or, you can just Google me, and my Luther Seminary email will come up as well if people want to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Thanks for this conversation. Thanks for this book. And thanks for all the good work that you're doing.
Thanks for having me.